meditation is an interesting thing because it's a practice of it's not a practice of accumulation. We're not trying to accumulate anything. We're trying to shed all that conditioning and just get down to the essence of who we really are. And there is it's an act of surrender, because I think it's a little scary. And this is why I think courage is so essential on the spiritual path, because it's although it's simple, meditation is fairly simple. Yoga in some ways is pretty simple, but to stay consistent and to fully show up in your body, that takes courage. And most people aren't willing to do it, in my experience.
Namaste. You're listening to the Savannah Podcast. Join us on an exploration of Eastern spirituality, yoga philosophy, and conscious living for the new age. This podcast is a production of SavannahSpirit.com, the best place to shop for unique clothing, spiritual handcrafted jewelry, healing gemstones, and fair trade gifts from the Far East. Now, here's your host, Brett Larkin.
Hello, Savannah family. Welcome back to the show. Thank you so much for being here. Today, we're continuing our conversation with Albert Flynn DeSilver, talking about writing as a path to awakening. We started this conversation on Tuesday, and today we're going to go deeper. We're going to discover why poetry, according to Albert, is the foundation of all great writing, and why it couples so well with yoga and meditation in particular. Albert's also going to open up and tell us about his failed TEDx talk, and why we should allow ourselves to write, even if we think what we're writing might be crap. He shares several breakthrough tips about the editing process, which I found really helpful, as well as some of his own favorite journaling prompts. I promise you that you won't think about poetry, reading, or writing the same way after this interview. Before we dive in, I need to remind you to support the show, to keep content like this coming to you for free. The two big ways you can do that are by leaving a rating or review here on iTunes, even if iTunes isn't how you normally listen to the show. And the other way is by making a purchase on SavannahSpirit.com. Savannah's an online shop for yoga clothing, healing jewelry, and unique spiritual fair trade gifts. More than that, what you may not know is that Savannah is also a family-owned business. It was founded by two brothers, and when they were traveling together in India, they witnessed the incredible hardships faced by children growing up in impoverished communities there. Wanting to help, they created Savannah, a company that would tackle vitamin A deficiency disorder in suffering children by selling spiritual jewelry, purposeful fashion, and fair trade items around the world. And that's the Savannah Spirit that you know today that also supports this podcast. So by making a purchase, you're supporting the show, supporting a family-owned business, supporting their larger social mission as well. And you can use that discount code podcast30 for 30% off your first order. All right, now let's dive back into our conversation with Albert. Albert, I'd love for you to tell us more about how we can be conscious readers. You touched on this at the end of the last episode, but I think it's really interesting, especially in this day and age where we are consuming so much written information a day, right? I mean, we have like our Twitter feeds and Facebook, Instagram, different magazines, different journals. I mean, I feel like there's just so much that we can be reading. And of course, I personally love reading a novel or a book or something, like a more spiritual text right before I go to bed, because it really helps me wind down. But you were saying at the end of Tuesday's episode that we can actually read in a conscious way where we let the words, it's almost like you were saying we let them infiltrate into our being, into our body, and then realize that those words are going to come through us the next time we go to write something. Am I explaining this correctly?
Yeah, no, that's great. You're doing great. Take it away, Brett.
Oh, this is really cool because I think it can bring a whole nother layer of, it's like conscious reading or...
Absolutely. No, I mean, this book could have been called Reading as a Path to Awakening. So I devote the whole second chapter to reading, because I believe that reading is writing, writing is reading. You can't have one without the other.
And this is such a lovely idea too, because it instead of, I mean, some people feel very creative from within, but some people maybe don't. And when you incorporate this conscious reading, it's like this conscious flow, continual flow of creativity coming in and then creativity coming out through you in a different, special way.
Yeah, and it comes back to this whole idea of seeing yourself in a much more broad way, that you're not just a blind, inert consumer. You're a participant in the writer's creation, and that without you, they don't exist. And so the more you can see yourself engaged in that conversation, I think the more liberating it is, and the more permission that gives you to explore your own ideas. I mean, I'm sort of thinking at some point when this book concept came up, I was like, do we really need another self-help book? Like, there's so many self-help books out there, right? And so many great books about writing and consciousness and spirituality and all that. And, how could I possibly do any better than Natalie Goldberg or, whoever? These are sort of the thoughts that were running through my head, right? And at some point I finally came to this realization that, oh yeah, but it's all coming through me. It's all going to be filtered through my little story, my ideas and my reading history and the anecdotes from my life. And maybe those can add to the conversation in an interesting way that might move people a little bit differently than, Natalie did or than Liz Gilbert did or et cetera, et cetera. So this gave me a sense of like, oh, I can do this. And this can actually add value to the conversation. And originally, when I started writing this book, I was like, oh, okay, I'm going to have them do this. And then I want to tell them how to do that. And then there's going to be this exercise. And then finally I was like, no. What makes a nonfiction book interesting is the stories, are the anecdotes. And so I started thinking about little anecdotes that could illustrate some of the ideas that I wanted to share. Then I ended up writing some little compressed, little memoir-y pieces. I wrote about my failed TEDx talk that became a really instructive little story about a lot of things, but about fear, about control, about truth, about devotion. So I think this is how I think that reading and engaging in a larger way is really important and really powerful.
I really relate to what you're saying because I train a lot of yoga teachers who come to my yoga teacher trainings or even some train with me online. And, the big fear they all have is like, well, do we really need another yoga teacher, right? Like, who wants to hear my voice? Who wants to hear what I have to say? And it's the same concept you're sharing here. It's, every time you take a class, just like every time you read a book, it's like you're bringing in creativity, right? Inspiration, you're getting inspired. And then that flows out through you. And it's always going to be unique and different because you're a unique individual. So whether it's writing or then you going to teach a class, you just by being your life experience, it's going to add something to the conversation, and helping people get that level of confidence is so important because otherwise it's like they don't feel like they have anything to share.
That's exactly it. And being willing to surrender to your own unique creative genius. That's a remarkable thing to do. I think it's a necessary thing to do because we do think, like, especially in this day and age, there's so much information out there. But like you say, what makes it interesting is the fact that you are a 1 in 7 billion or however many people there are on the planet, unique individual expression of consciousness. And no other being on this planet has lived the life that you've lived, has noticed the things that you've noticed, have read the things that you've read, have moved the way that you've moved. And all of that comes into the expressive self and comes onto the page in a different kind of way. It can be interesting, that can be inspiring, that can help people.
And you said surrender to your own unique creative genius, which is so different from achieving it, trying to practice for it. Can you say a little bit more about the surrender piece?
Yeah, I think there's somewhat of a drive, like particularly in our culture, there's kind of an ego drive to cling on to certain ideals or ways that we're supposed to be. I mean, we get conditioned into being thinking that we need to be someone else or something in particular rather than just being ourselves. And this is another way that the meditation practice is so powerful, is that it's this constantly returning to self, surrendering to the mystery that is the self. And we let go over time. Meditation is an interesting thing because it's a practice of it's not a practice of accumulation. We're not trying to accumulate anything. We're trying to shed all that conditioning and just get down to the essence of who we really are. And there is it's an act of surrender because I think it's a little scary. And this is why I think courage is so essential on the spiritual path, because it's although it's simple, meditation is fairly simple. Yoga in some ways is pretty simple, but to stay consistent and to fully show up in your body, that takes courage. And most people aren't willing to do it, in my experience.
I'm glad we're now talking a little bit about courage, because so far we've been talking a lot about really writing and journaling for one's own spiritual evolution, let's say. But I know a lot of people have a dream of writing a book, right? That's a big dream for so many people. And I know for tons of people who attend your workshops. Yes, it can be very intimidating. It requires a lot of discipline, I imagine. But a huge part of that whole industry is rejection, right? Like Elizabeth Gilbert wrote her whole book. I can't remember what it's called, but it was all about how she heard no for like the first 10 years or something. And you just mentioned, I'm so nice that you're really opened up and you mentioned that failed TEDx talk. Can you tell us a little bit more? What is a failed TEDx talk? Is that a TEDx talk that didn't happen, or a TEDx talk that happened and went very, very wrong?
It just didn't happen very well.
Got it. Okay.
Yeah. No, it was a TEDx talk in which actually the talk itself I thought was pretty good. Like the content was pretty great, but I just allowed, like, I wanted it. I had so many great ideas about how I wanted it to be, and I was so petrified. And my attention was totally focused in the wrong direction. I was focusing on me and my terror rather than them and their education, them being the audience. And so it was this I had a total revelation after that, and started training in the other direction, and it changed everything for me. Yeah, I promised myself I'd never feel that scared ever again, because in anticipation of a talk, because it's just so like self-absorptive as opposed to, and that's not what you're there to do. You're there to connect with the audience and to open up to the audience. And so it's a really great learning experience.
I love that you share that. What other tips do you have for people who are looking to write a book or trying to get the courage to figure out how to write a book? And, I think we've talked about so many lovely things like meditating and staying present and writing from the body, which is such a cool concept and I love it. But I know one of my writing teachers in college, she said, sometimes you just have to glue your butt to the chair, like that's the only way that something's going to get done. So for someone who wants to maybe dabble in writing a book or explore that dream, what advice do you have for them?
Well, I think it begins with intention and purpose. Like, why do you want to write this thing? Get clear on that. Like, what's your motivation? And what do you think this can add to the conversation? And really connect deeply with your desire around it. And because ultimately it's kind of simple in a way, the writing practice, it is just, you have to sit your ass down in the chair and just do it and just write every day and allow yourself to write crap. I think that's one of the most liberating that I've ever learned is don't expect things to go well, especially at first. But if you stay consistent and show up every day, day after day, you will see things evolve. And even if it's only for 5 or 10 minutes, maybe you can only squeeze in 10 minutes of writing time 5 days a week. Well, if you do that consistently, you're going to wind up with at least 200, 250 words a day. And I mean, you do the math, but you do that 5 times a week, that's 1,200 something words. And then 3 months and then 6 months. By a year, you have 50,000 words. And it may be a mess, but you'll have material to work with and you can start to tease things out and you can learn the editing skills and you can pull out some of your best ideas and your best lines and your best phrases. But it's really going to start to evolve and to change and to get good through the practice of it, not through the thinking about it.
I've heard that so many successful writers that are very disciplined, right? They always get, whether they're right in the morning or at night, that they have almost like a ritual and that it always happens and there's this structure around it. Have you found that to be true or helpful?
Yeah, I mean, when I'm working on a project, I'm there showing up 6-7 days a week, usually for anywhere between 3 and 7 or 8 hours.
And do you force yourself to sort of start at the same time each day, or do you have a little bit more fluidity around?
I mean, generally, like I'm very lucky right now because I'm I'm just writing and teaching full time. That wasn't always the case. I had a business several years ago that I had to show up for, 8 to 10 hours a day. But I managed, over the 7 years I had that business, I managed to write 2 books.
Wow, that's really inspiring for people. So that was happening early in the morning, late at night. Tell us more about that.
Exactly. Yeah. So I wrote on weekends. I would get up a half hour earlier and I'd write for 20 minutes before work. Fortunately, I owned the business, so I could call in sick. There were a couple days. But the first 2 or 3 years of having this business, it was 12-hour days and it was really intense. We didn't have any help. So it was hard. But that's why I think it's so important to connect with your desire. Because during that time, the first book that I wrote, the first prose book, was my memoir. And I had that story in my body and it needed to come out. So the desire was so strong that I would stay up late to write, even though I didn't like writing at night and felt like my brain was mush. But I would still get a few ideas down. So it can be done. And eventually this can go into complement with taking a writing class, going to a writing retreat or workshop, so you can have some more time to write. We all have to figure out how we can weave it into our lives, given what the demands are. But the consistency is everything.
Yeah, it's just like anything else. If you wanted to, run a marathon, you'd run every day and train and practice. And it's the same here with writing. You said earlier something I thought was interesting about editing skills. And I'd love for you to talk a little bit, because we've been talking about writing from the body, writing from the present moment. But then you shift into the editing process, right? And when you're doing the editing, does that become a little bit more linear up in the mind as you're, reviewing what you wrote and tweaking it? Or is that something that can sort of mindfully happen in the body as well? And how does that work? And do you edit right after you write something, or do you kind of get a bunch of words on the page and then go back and edit later? I'd love for you to tell us more about that process.
Yeah, so both and. You're right, it does take a little bit more linear mind, more, what's the term I'm looking for?
Like more left brain or something? I don't know.
Yeah, where you're just kind of in your mind, you're thinking a lot about like how to improve this line, this phrase, this paragraph, this page. So I have a whole process that I go through in the book, my writing process that people can sort of look at and tweak and make their own. Editing the more you think about it in terms of it's integrated into the practice of the writing, the less it'll seem like a chore, because I try and remain as curious as possible through that editing process. Because even though it can be really frustrating, that's also where you start to see the transformation, where you go from a flat, ordinary sentence to one with a surprising and curious metaphor, or one with some surprising detail you never thought that you could write. And you start to think about it like sculpting, where you're chipping away, you're adding, you're painting over, you're massaging and changing until it starts to take on a shape. Now, it also becomes physical and embodied when you read out loud. And reading out loud is an integral part of the editing process for me. I usually, towards my ending edits or my final editing push, I'll read out loud. That'll be the last thing I do. Although in poetry, when I'm working with poems, it becomes primary through the whole process because poetry comes out of the oral tradition. But in prose, it's really remarkable to read it out loud and then to record it and play it back, because you hear things so differently. And you're like, oh, I need to pull out a couple words, or, oh, I need to add in a couple words here. I need to delete that paragraph, or I need to, add some similes and metaphors and more sensory detail, or et cetera, et cetera.
That's so interesting. So you'll do that even with a book as opposed to a poem, prose. You'll actually read it, record it, and play it back.
Yeah, I've been working on the final edits for my second novel, and I've been recording the chapters in my iPhone and then playing them back, just to get that rhythm and to get that sound and to really hear it from a different perspective, so that I can just get a better sense of it and how it sounds.
That's so interesting. That's such a good tip. I wanted to ask you a little bit before we let you go, just like, why poetry? Because I know you're an award-winning poet. And I mean, poetry just seems, in the age of Twitter and everything we have going on, it's like, is poetry still happening? And clearly it is. How is it related to the spiritual part, like a spiritual awakening, for people who, like most of our listeners, are committed to a spiritual path. They're doing yoga, they're doing meditation. And, are we all kind of amateur poets if we want to be, or what's...
Sure. I mean, poetry is essential. I think poetry is the ground of all great writing, first of all. Poetry is the language of possibility, be that in writing or in being, in life. Think about it. Poetry doesn't have a great standing in our culture, but if you think about it across cultures, across the political spectrum, whether people live in Texas or Louisiana or Florida or Washington State or wherever, and whatever their class background, poetry shows up at the most crucial points of life. It shows up at births. It shows up at deaths. It shows up at weddings, at unions. The most human points of our experience in our consciousness, poetry is there to mark those transitions and transformations. And it's also, there's a timeless quality. We can't understand always intellectually, that we understand through spiritual web of the heart. And I think it's just so essential it's so essential to my being. One of my favorite lines ever is from Carl Sandburg, who said that poetry is an echo asking a shadow to dance. So it deals in the realms of the ineffable and the undefinable, the spacious, the magical, the transformational. And it's that way that we can give language to that which we cannot know, but that is truth, that makes language possible, that space that makes language possible. That's the realm of poetry.
I'm like taking notes as I'm listening to you, getting so inspired, because I feel like the way you're talking about poetry, it's so much more interpretive than prose, right? And I feel like you're almost talking about this kind of like negative space where there's just like this mystery there, where I understand what you're saying. It's like how poetry is almost dealing more with the subtle realms of our being, of our existence. And because poetry can't really say everything the way prose does, it leaves a little bit open to each of our own interpretation, right? And that's also very magical, because it's like how I experience a poem is so different than how you might experience a poem in terms of what it evokes in our internal landscape, right?
Mm-hmm. Well, and I think one of the most popular poets right now is Rumi. Was writing...
Yes.
or the 13th century. And it's like, how is that possible that a poet writing in the 13th century could be read and understood by so many Americans, for example? And, Rumi I think he was born in Iran and grew up in Turkey. So this is kind of the magical, that sort of tells you everything that you need to know about how poetry can transcend culture, it can transcend time, and it lives in the realms of the eternal. You said, why poetry?
Yeah.
It's a really great new book by Matthew Zapruder, who's a Bay Area writer and poet. And his new book is called Why Poetry. He talks a lot about the expectations that most people have around reading poetry. They're expecting some kind of a logical narrative thing to happen, which happens with most language and most communication. But with poetry, that's not it. It's more about music. It's more about ephemerality. It's more about the unexpected. And when we can let go of those expectations, the narrative and the logical expectations, it opens us up into this way that we can experience poetry in a more profound and meanful way.
And can we all be poets? Just like we're doing our free writing potentially and, dabbling in the journaling. Do you just have any quick tips for someone who wants to maybe incorporate a little bit of poetry into their spiritual practice or yoga or meditation practice?
Oh, yeah. Just desire is key. Engagement, curiosity.
And probably reading poetry, right? Like if it's something you want to write, reading it.
Oh, absolutely.
And I know, again, because I'm coming from the yoga context, but, there's a teacher I collaborated with this weekend, and she always reads a little poem or quote at the end of her yoga class, and it's so lovely.
Yeah. So that the reading is absolutely key. If you want to write, and just being able to enjoy the presence of that words and the kind of unexpected and beautiful twists of language, even if you don't understand it sort of logically, maybe you just enjoy it. This was a criticism often hurled at Gertrude Stein, who was notorious. She was a friend of Picasso's, and she wrote this really wacky avant-garde poetry that nobody understood at the time, and she used to get a lot of flack for it. But she said, well, do you enjoy it? And this one interviewer said, well, yes, I do rather enjoy it. And she said, well, if you enjoy it, then you understand it. So enjoyment equals understanding. I think that's the place to get to with poetry, is just to find those words, those poems that you enjoy, that resonate for you in some unexpected way, and go from there.
Yeah, I love that enjoyment equals understanding. I wrote that down and underlined it. I really like that because, so often in school, even our experience with poetry was you were dissecting it with the class and then figuring out like the correct meaning, right, of the poem or the theme that the teacher was sort of trying to say. And you're saying it's just so much simpler than that. If we read a poem and we enjoy it, that's kind of all we have to focus on right now. And the understanding exactly what it means or means to us will just come naturally later, as long as we enjoy those words.
Exactly. That was my experience. And I taught as a California poet in the schools for so many years. And the cool thing about that program was it was all about empowering kids to write from their direct experience, to write from the heart poetically. And I would offer some prompts and some examples, and they would just go and allow their imaginations to flow. And they would write the most beautiful, arresting, fantastic stuff, because it's just there within them already. And these are like 3rd and 4th graders,
Oh, it's so cool. I was going to say, Albert, this is my last question for you before I let you go. I just didn't want to have you come on the show without, hopefully, if you're open to, can you just share with me and the listeners just 1 or 2 of your favorite journaling prompts that you use to get started, or that you like to share in your workshops?
Sure. Yeah, there's a couple that I love from the book. One, my favorite is a letter to an emotion. So you kind of, it's a whole process I do at the workshop, but basically you can start by checking in your body, taking a few deep breaths and feeling into the sensations you're experiencing in this direct moment, checking in with your heart, seeing how you feel, and beginning with a single word how you would name that emotion or that feeling. Whether it's grief or sadness or joy or excitement or whatever that word is, and then writing that down, and then writing a letter to that emotion and address them as if you were talking to them, and imagining if that emotion could take on certain physical characteristics or even animalistic characteristics. How would you describe them? What would you say to them? What questions would you ask this emotion or this feeling? And see where that takes you.
I love that. That's a really fun one.
Yeah, so that's one. Another one of my favorites is around, let's see, of course I'm so, I've been so in this book that I've lost track of all my great ideas. I have this photo exercise, which I really love. So, because everyone has a phone and a camera with them at all times, there's an exercise in which, I invite people to take, to do some sort of free photographing of just things that draw their attention based on color, based on shape, and not really overthink it, but just take like a few photographs, a couple dozen, have a specified period of time, like a half hour. You get on a walk in the park or nature preserve or wherever, and you just start shooting from the hip. And then you take like your top 3 pictures that you just like the best because of the way they're framed or the colors or whatever. And then you just free write from those particular pictures and see what sort of emotions start to come out from journaling into what you're seeing visually.
That's interesting. I could see how interesting things might come up because you're writing based off a theme, like these snapshots, right? Like why were you called to them? What was interesting for you there? And then you get to kind of go deeper into that.
Exactly. And really writing into the specifics of what you're seeing, colors, the shapes, the sounds, etc.
Well, Albert, thank you so much for joining us. I'm holding your book in my hands, but can you tell the listeners a little bit more about you, your book, how they can get the book, how they can stay connected with you online, and how they can find you?
Sure. Yeah. So the book is Writing as a Path to Awakening, a year to becoming an excellent writer and living an awakened life. And again, it's broken down into 12 chapters. It takes us throughout the 12 months of the year. Their theme, there's 12 meditations and 12 writing exercises. Plus, it's sprinkled with a whole bunch of try this, try that. There's a bunch of little kind of sub exercises throughout the book that people have found very helpful. Can be found at www.albertflynndesilver.com. And I've got a couple of exciting upcoming events. For those people in the Bay Area, I'll be teaching down at 1440, the Multiversity, which is brand new down near Santa Cruz. That's June 8th through the 10th. And that's a weekend intensive. We'll do writing exercises and meditation. There's really good food down there. It's a great place to just be and reconnect to your creative self. And then for those who want to venture to the East Coast, I'll be doing a week-long retreat out at the Omega Institute in Rhinebeck, New York. And that is an extraordinary opportunity to really go deep into your writing practice. And if you have a book project, you want time to write, you want time to really deepen your meditation practice, that is going to be an extraordinary week. It's actually retreat week at the Omega Institute, which is a very special time to be there. So you can find out all of that on the website.
Amazing. And I'll put the links to your website right below this podcast, wherever you may be listening to it. Albert, thank you so much for coming on the show. Savannah listeners, let me know what you thought of this week's episode. Remember, the number one way you can support the show is really simply by just leaving a rating or review on iTunes, even if iTunes isn't how you normally listen to the show. And if you're not sure how to leave a review, just go to savannahspirit.com/review, and we have step-by-step instructions for you. I really hope you feel inspired to do some writing and maybe even to write a poem this week or weekend. I'm sending you so much love from my heart to yours. Namaste.
You've been listening to the Savannah Podcast. To find out more about Savannah, go to savannahspirit.com or follow Savannah on Facebook at facebook.com/Savannah Spirit. For daily inspiration, check out our blog at savannaeast.com. Be sure to join us next week for a new episode, and thank you for listening to the Savannah Podcast.